is that when we look out on the world, everything appears to exist independent of us. And when we talk about this idea of independent existence, in the text there are in the texts there are many terms used to describe this. Three are very commonly used. The one that is very commonly used, probably most often used, is the word inherent existence. And so again, this term has the meaning that of things being self-existent, that the world is made up of many separate, discrete things, each one having their own unique identity. Another term that's commonly used is existing from its own side. And this term has the connotation or meaning that there seems to be a world already out there waiting for us to experience it. That things do not need an observer to exist. That they simply exist from their own side. They're already out there existing, just waiting for us to come along to confirm their existence. So that's what existing from its own side means, existing without the need of an observer. And the other term that's very commonly used is true existence. And again, generally the word true, something is true if it doesn't deceive us. Now, things appear to exist independent of us. If that's really how they exist, they would be true, meaning the way in which they appear and the way in which they actually exist matches. So true existence means existing in the same way in which it appears. So all of these three terms, of course, are describing the same thing. They're describing independent existence from slightly different perspectives. So these are the three most common terms used. There are other terms used as well, but I think these are probably three of the most common terms. So, of course, here, within Mahayana, and remember the Mahayana traditions are based on these perfection of wisdom teachings of the Buddha, and these teachings in the perfection of wisdom about emptiness were then elucidated upon by great Indian master Nagarjuna from the 2nd century. And he wrote his classic text, Mula Madhyamika Karika, which often translated into English means the fundamental wisdom of the middle way. And so he described this idea of emptiness in that text. And that teaching, or that text, and particularly Nagarjuna himself, is said to be then the founder of the Madhyamika philosophical system. So, and Madhyamika, often the word Madhyamika is translated as middle way philosophical system. And within the Madhyamika system, or philosophical system, there are a number of sub-schools. Because this idea of emptiness is very difficult to appreciate. So there are a couple of slight different interpretations of what it really means, emptiness. The one that we are trying to explain today is the understanding from what's called the Prasangika system, sub-school within Madhyamika. So this idea of emptiness, the way we're going to explain it, is in accordance with this system called the Prasangika, which is one of the sub-schools within the Madhyamika. So there's a question down the back.
Yes. Yeah, can you please remind what is perfection of wisdom?
So perfection of wisdom was the teachings that the Buddha gave in this second turning the wheel. So mainly in the area around Rajgir, close to Bodh Gaya, where he achieved enlightenment. And perfection of wisdom is these teachings on emptiness. So there are a number of different perfection of wisdom teachings, and three that are very well known. Often they're called the three mothers, and they are the extensive, middling, and brief perfection of wisdom sutras. The extensive is teaching the one that's 100,000 stanzas, so a stanza is 4 lines. The middling is 25,000 stanzas, and the brief is only 8,000 stanzas long. And of course, probably the most famous sutra from the collection of teachings is the Heart Sutra. So the Heart Sutra is only 25 stanzas long. So it's a very brief teaching. So Heart Sutra is something that is commonly studied in a lot of the Mahayana traditions on this topic of emptiness.
What's the names of the other sutras? The longer sutras?
Well, there are many, but three of them that are very commonly are called the extensive, middling, and brief perfection of wisdom. And sometimes they're given the name the three mothers because they're the three main ones. Okay. So, of course, here then in the Madhyamika system, specifically this Prasangika school, what we're saying is that if we investigate closely, we'll come to see the world does not exist as it appears. There is no independent objective world there. There is no independent subjective me here. So what they're saying then is that things are empty of inherent existence, meaning things are not inherently existent, or in other words, things are not independently existent. Why? Because they are dependently existent. And so that's usually described using the term dependent arising. So things are empty of inherent existence, meaning not independently existent. So that term, empty of inherent existence, this is emptiness. So again, emptiness is the fact that things are empty of inherent existence. They're not independently existent. So emptiness is not saying nothing really exists. Emptiness is simply saying they do not exist independently. Why? Because they are dependently existent. So the term used here is dependent arising. The word arising means coming into existence. So things come into existence dependently. So in other words, things are not independent because they are dependent. So therefore, to better understand this idea of emptiness, what is very helpful, of course, then, is to understand what do we mean by things being dependent. Because if we can appreciate that, then we can understand the flip side of that better, the idea of emptiness. So that's what I'd like to do now, is have a look at what does it mean that things are dependently existent, that they come into existence dependently. And here there are 3 ways we can talk about things being dependent. The first way in which things exist dependently is they exist depending on causes and conditions. For example, this laptop here exists depending on causes and conditions. One of the first conditions necessary for this to exist, of course, someone needed to think about designing this laptop. And then, of course, all the raw materials needed to be gathered, they needed to be refined, the various components needed to be manufactured, and then these components needed to be assembled. And then, of course, all the people and factories and so forth involved in that process were also necessary. So this laptop exists depending on all of those causes and conditions. Without them, there would be no laptop. So I think this is quite not so difficult to appreciate. But also, of course, everything exists depending on their parts. Again, this laptop exists depending on its parts. Because without the metal casing, the screen, the keyboard, battery, electronic components, without all of these parts, there would be no laptop here. So again, I think this is not so difficult to appreciate. But remember, what we're saying is that because things are dependent, they cannot be independent.
That's tautology.
Sorry?
This is tautology.
Correct.
Mm-hmm. So
exactly.
We didn't say anything by stating this.
Right. But the thing is that I think for most of us, we can happily accept that this laptop depends on causes and conditions and exists depending on its parts, but at the same time, we can happily accept that when we walk in the door, there's already a laptop existing here independently on the table. True? Probably, yeah. But that's illogical. The laptop can't be dependent and independent at the same time. The reason that there doesn't seem to be that contradiction is that we don't really appreciate these two ideas at the deepest level. We only understand them a little bit superficially. So to understand these two ideas at the deeper level, we have to go to the third way in which things are dependent. That things exist depending on labelling, conception, or designation. So these three terms all mean the same thing. So if you understand one of those words, you understand all three, because they're saying the same thing. So when we look at this, again, we may think, I think I know what that means. It means there's a thing here on the table that we're calling a laptop. Again, that's a little bit superficial understanding of what we mean by labelling, conception, designation. To begin to appreciate what that really means is what we can understand or appreciate is that when we look out on the world, we are receiving a mass of sense data, particularly visual data. And to make sense or meaning out of all of this stuff, we have to make it into meaningful objects. So what we do is we draw lines around various collections of data. We create meaningful objects. But we need to do more than that, because in order to be able to communicate with others, we need to give names to the things that we've created to communicate. So labelling, conception, designation is this process of drawing lines, creating objects, and then giving them a name. How we do that is not fixed. It's completely arbitrary, depending on the meaning that we want to get from the world.
To get from the world?
The meaning that we want to establish.
To put on the world.
Yeah, exactly. For example, how many things are there? probably most often we would simply draw one line around all of that data, create one object and call it a star. Most often. But on other occasions it may be more meaningful to draw two lines and say there's two triangles there. Some other occasions it may be more meaningful to draw 6 lines and say there's 6 triangles there. Or another occasion 7 lines to say there's 6 triangles and a hexagon. Or on other occasions it may be more meaningful to say there's a collection of 18 lines there. So is there 1, 2, 6, 7 or 18 objects there? How many objects are there? We decide. Which means that there is no star to be found there from its own side, independent of our conceptual framework. We create the star in our conceptual framework. So therefore, here we have two terms that we often hear. The two terms are, things are merely labelled and not findable. So merely labelled, merely meaning only just, means things only exist within our conceptual framework. There is no star to be found there independent of our conceptual framework. And not findable means you cannot find the object in the basis. There is no star to be found there in the basis because the star only exists in our conceptual framework. So not findable does not mean we can't find a laptop on the table. That's not what the meaning of not findable. Not findable means you cannot find a laptop there in the basis from its own side because the laptop only exists in our conceptual framework. So these are two terms that are commonly used here. Now, we are, of course, so therefore we are line drawers, and we are continually improving our ability to do this, to try to generate more and more better meaning in our world. And we know often the case is when we come into some new unfamiliar situation and we see something in front of us and we don't recognise because we've never really seen something like this before, we have a lot of difficulty in drawing lines. You know, is all of this just one thing or is it a collection of things? What's going on here? So we have difficulty drawing a line, creating meaning. So this is something we are continually improving, this process of drawing lines, creating objects to generate meaning in our life. And sorry? Yeah, sure.
How come we all see the laptop and now this is a laptop?
Because for us as humans, normally this is the most meaningful thing for us to create, to use. But not always do we see laptop. For example, we may see, oh, here's a something to put my cup of tea on. A placemat. No? Sometimes. Or we can, if we've got a lot of papers flying, we can put it on top. It's a paperweight. No? Or, of course, is there one object there? Or can we say, actually, I've got about 50 keys there.
Yeah, but how come now we all...
Because we're all human, and for us as a human, most often the most meaningful thing to create is one object and call it a laptop, because that's what's most meaningful to us in many situations, but not all situations.
Meaningful or agreement?
Same thing.
No,
same
not
thing.
the same thing.
Meaning comes through agreement.
Agreement is something different.
Yeah, but I mean that's part of meaning is agreement.
Yeah, but if you take someone from some tribe in,
In Ethiopia,
whenever,
we don't
and
know
put
what
it
it
here,
is.
and you
You-
won't see a laptop.
No, he'll see some object to maybe smash something over the head with, or something to, I don't know what he'll see. Lots of things. And of course, yeah, anyway, we're going to come to this.
So it's also connected to communication, like agreement.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's not
Because we need to, exactly, so,
Culture.
yeah, exactly. So it's all, we create all of this, don't we?
in order to communicate with each
Yeah,
other.
sure. So we're creating our world of experience and doing that so that we can function and so that we can communicate, of course. Of course.
The paragraph from Alan Wallace was mainly about the observer, and here it's kind of artificial, the observer. Oh, yes, it is in the three, but not, for instance, the sense organs. They are not. It's not here the observer.
No, because I haven't come to that yet. That's the next,
Okay.
it's coming.
Okay.
So it's much easier to begin discussion by looking at objects, and then on that basis we turn our attention to the subject. So, but that's still to come. Okay. Okay, so let's now have a look at these two ideas, causes and conditions and paths, based on this understanding here. So this is a timeline. This is a seed, and this is the plant that it produces. So we say the plant exists depending on causes and conditions. So the underlying cause of the plant is the seed, and the conditions, of course, include soil, sunlight, water, and so forth. So through those causes and conditions, we end up with the plant. Now, the question is, at what time does the seed become the plant? And so generally, of course, we believe things exist independent of us. So if things exist independent of us, it should be a fixed, obvious point at where the seed becomes the plant. So at what point here does the seed become the plant? And the point at which it becomes the plant, we can understand, is the point at which this configuration of data stops looking like our concept of seed and starts looking like our concept of plant. And we all have slightly different concepts of what is a seed and a plant. So for some of us, this is already a plant. For some of us it's here, for some of us it's here, some of us it's in here. So we decide when the seed becomes the plant. Another point is we say that the seed and plant are in a cause and effect relationship. And by definition, if two things are in a cause and effect relationship, it means they cannot exist simultaneously. So the question here is, does the seed stop existing before the plant comes into existence? So again, does the seed stop existing before the plant comes into existence? Yes or no? Which is it? If we say no, that means the seed exists at the same time as the plant. That's illogical, impossible if they're in a cause and effect relationship. So no is illogical. So if you say yes, the seed has ceased to exist, where is the plant coming from? Yes is also illogical. Both no and yes are illogical, which means that our idea of causality based on independent existence is actually illogical. It cannot function, it cannot work. And these are the sorts of arguments that Nagarjuna uses in his Mula Madhyamika Karika text, the fundamental wisdom of the middle way. He uses these types of arguments to refute independent existence. He says things like, you believe in causality? How does that work? What about agent and action? How does that work? Fire and fuel, how does that work? So he gives all of these examples to show that if we are believing in independent existence, then these ideas become illogical, they cannot work.
How do you frame causality
Right. So again, this goes, the question is, how will we frame causality from a dependent point of view? So again, this goes back more or less, it's the same idea as we looked at the other day, the other day of impermanence. You know, the idea of impermanence we often hear is that things are changing moment by moment. So often we feel, okay, in this moment there's a thing, in the next moment it becomes something else, in the next moment it becomes something else. So this, of course, is based on the idea of things existing independently. And of course this is also how we have the idea of seed and plant. The seed slowly moves and becomes a plant. But again, if we have this idea of impermanence or causality, it cannot work. It cannot work. So therefore, as we saw with impermanence, then this is not impermanence. Impermanence is this. It's a continuous flow of change. And this is dependent causality, that there is simply a continuous flow of change. And within that continuous flow of change, to make sense of that flow of change, we create objects in that flow. Oh, here is a seed. Oh, now it's a plant. So all we're doing is we're just changing our labelling. So this is dependent causality.
Didn't Nagarjuna also based his theory on his own logic, which only exists in his conceptual framework? Like you say it's not logic that the seed and the plant exist at the same time. It's only in his logical, a specific logical system.
No, but I mean, for us, when we talk about causality, that's what we created, the idea. Causality means things cannot exist simultaneously. If two things are in a cause and effect relationship, by definition, they can't exist simultaneously. That is our theory of causality. That's our understanding. That is causality. So if they exist simultaneously, then there's no causal relationship. So there's no causality. It's not about his theory. It's just that's causality. That's how we've created the idea of causality, what it means. And of course, here, when we're looking at these things, and particularly this idea of emptiness, you can only know this through your direct experience. So this is just a framework of understanding to help us then to investigate ourselves to see whether things are really like this or not. Because merely this intellectual understanding is not really going to change very much. It's just another theory. We have to test the theory, and that's what Vipassana practice is about. So all I'm doing this morning is presenting the Buddhist theory of reality. Might sound good, maybe not, but the only way to validate that or refute it is to investigate, to see how things actually exist in our own direct experience, and that's Vipassana practice.
I don't understand why couldn't it be that there is a cause and a result, something, and they can be together although they are changing all the time. There's seed, then the plant, and it's changing all the time in the process, and still one is causing the other. Could be the same time, no?
But that's
it's for me.
that's what cause and result mean for us, is that one precedes the other.
So why do you say that it cannot be in the same time?
Because it's not preceding it then. If it's at the same time, it's not preceding it. So it's not cause. That's causality. That's what, when we talk causality, it means, like you said, one precedes the other. Precede means comes before.